Michael Jackson is an allegory for so many things, you know, the anxieties of race, of the body, of love, of the African-American popular culture tradition, of fame, of sex, of queerness, so many things. He's the gift that keeps on giving as a metaphor, I'll say that.
This is Writers Mosaic in Conversation. Founding editor Gabriel Gbadamosi talks to poet and essayist Vanessa Kisuule about grappling with sometimes conflicting thoughts, ideas and emotions in her writing.
Vanessa Kisuule, thank you for talking to me, Gabriel Gbadamosi, for Writers Mosaic.
You're very welcome.
You started your career as a spoken word artist, winning and losing slams all over the country and then internationally. Could you speak to us about your entry into writing through slam poetry competitions, the spoken word?
I think what I like about performing especially is that the poem naturally takes the shape of its specific context from performance to performance. So each night is different, each audience is different, and you feel different every time you read the poem aloud. And so the poem is never the same way twice. And I like to think it replicates what happens when you read a poem to yourself over and over many months or years. It will give you different resonances and meanings.
Do you hone the works in the reading?
Exactly.
Are they constantly shifting and changing and developing?
And I think you have an opportunity to do more with that as a performer or as a reader of your work in live space than you do when you have essentially nailed the transcript to the page. And like I said, the reader is then the person that gives it new life every time they return to the poem. But that's a very private thing that's occurring within their own mind. Unless, of course, they read that work aloud. And, you know, I always say to people when I run workshops that poetry is supposed to be read aloud. It's musical. When a poet thinks about meter and pace and the sonic implications of a one-word choice over another, that is a musical consideration. So you're not really going to feel those choices unless you hear them out of your own mouth, you know. So poetry is meant to be read aloud.
In your poem, Take Up Space, you literally have the line, it's a paean of praise and encouragement to women and to poets and to dissident identities. But you say, we are walking pillars of defiance in every exhale of breath.
Yeah.
So presumably, you're talking about your experience of being a performance poet. How would you kind of speak to that for anyone listening who wants to start speaking, talking, declaiming their poetry?
Well, you know, that poem is really old, and I feel quite torn now. You know, I'm a bit older, I'm a little bit more jaded. I do stand by the basic principle that to be vocal, to be visible and audible in your truth, whatever that may be, is a courageous act. For some of us more than others, I must stress. But, you know, I think fundamentally as a human being to declare and express who you are in all of your complexity and entirety is a brave thing. But I guess as we've grown further into this culture now where everyone technically has a platform in that wild west that is the internet, to ask ourselves, okay, you know, what am I saying? To what end? How refined and considered is what I'm saying? Because now it seems that, you know, everybody wants to speak, everybody wants to say something. I do wonder about the prudence of that sometimes, because now that we have that opportunity, the gatekeepers have been swept away, which is good, but I think we don't quite know what to do with that freedom sometimes. My advice would be, yes, please speak your truth, especially when you don't already see it being spoken to out there in the world. But think hard about the best way to do it, the most artful and honest and nuanced way to do it, because it's tempting to just go out there and just say anything, but to cut through the white noise of all the opinions and songs and poems floating around in the ether, I think we need people that have really thought through what they want to offer to the
listener.
canon
to the canon.
Exactly.
We need another kind of level of discrimination which needs to come from the writers themselves.
Yes.
Around what they put up, what they connect to, and how they connect.
I don't want to go back to the days of, the stronghold of legacy media, and all of its inevitable biases towards the typical suspects, the white, the middle and upper middle classes, the male, the straight, etc. The internet has done wonderful things for giving people that were silenced for so long their own platforms and their own means. But I think, like any being suddenly given free reign, we're kind of in the nascence of that freedom, and we're in the teething process, and that really shows in the and I say that for myself too. I'm someone who perhaps didn't show as much discernment as I'd have liked in my earlier career, because I was so giddy on the idea that I could write something and then just put it out there on the internet.
You do say that there are 3 pillars to your practice. Curiosity, honesty, and messiness. Let's take them one by one. What are you curious about?
Everything, probably to my detriment. I'm not very focused. I am very easily distractible. I'm just deeply curious about why people think the way they do, particularly if I find their thinking troubling or even abhorrent. I'm especially interested in that. I think you're far more likely to change things once you understand deeply why they happen and you have compassion for why they happen. Yeah, that's what I'm curious about at the moment.
The second one, honesty. I think most people can understand it's very difficult to be honest, most of all with yourself.
Yes.
But you seem to mean something more about it, and certainly in reference to the writer James Baldwin, who in his autobiography or his kind of manifesto for being a writer said, I want to be an honest person, an honest man, and a good writer. What does honesty mean beyond, of course, the struggle that we all have?
I think you have to be really self-excavating, because if we're going to demand accountability and honesty from our leaders, our politicians, our journalists, we have to know what it feels like to move through that ourselves as individuals, to know when we're being hypocritical, to know when we are being self-serving, shallow in our thinking. And when you've really done that, you'll know how difficult it is. And so you'll know what it is you're asking of the people who call the shots. And we should be asking that of them. But I think very few of us actually walk the walk on that. So I think that's a constant demand we must make of ourselves as individuals, and know that it's an imperfect process.
You also say, in relation to being in Britain, that there is, of course, everything that comes with being a black artist and a black person in Britain, and being marginalised and so on. You directly experience it and feel it. And so honesty carries for you a kind of a political demand to be listened to be able to take up space. Now, there's a peculiar thing within your poetry that I've started to notice.
Oh dear.
Oh, well, let's go to that poem of yours which went viral.
Yes.
Hollow.
Yes.
About the toppling of the Coulston statue in Bristol. And you have been the Poet Laureate of Bristol.
Yes.
That quite clearly was channeling the English Romantic poet Shelley, Ozymandias.
Was it clearly, unbeknownst to me, people referenced it after the fact, and when kids have been studying that poem in schools, teachers have given them that reference point. It was not in my head when I wrote it, but maybe subconsciously I was aware. Yes.
I'm going to ask you to read a poem which you sent to me called Daffodil.
Oh, okay.
And when anyone hears the word daffodil and poem,
of Wordsworth.
They think of Wordsworth.
Yeah.
Can we hear, just so that the listeners can get a version of your poem, can we hear Daffodil?
I don't know if the reincarnation gods are taking requests, but in the next life, I'd like to come back as a daffodil. Custard adjacent signal of spring, insatiably butter dish bright and brazen, baby. Brazen as a fart at a funeral. No one will tell me diddly, 'cause who in their right mind chastises a daffodil? My trumpet head will point to the empty throne of the sky as I shoplift joy from the soil. If you must pluck me from my home, I promise not to wilt till you reach your silent house. Okay. Place me in a mug of water by the sink. We'll both pretend it is an act of kindness.
Daffodil. Vanessa Kisule's version. I love some of the lines. Custard adjacent.
Yeah.
Insatiably butter.
Yeah.
You very much made it your own.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it is talking about the earth. It is
Yeah.
talking about nature. It is talking about English nature in the way that the English Romantic poets did. In another poem of yours, which anyone listening could go onto YouTube and see you perform, The Earth's Thirst, you're standing in a very recognisably English landscape. And you're talking about a condition of drought that somehow we have imposed on nature. And this poem is to slake the earth's thirst. It ends a description of itself as being a poem in penance, a long, slow drink for your troubles, addressing itself to the earth.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me, to us, a little bit about your relationship with England, with its nature, with its sense of place, and your own practice as a poet within it?
I must say, no one's read my work with as much depth and care as you have, or at least not to my knowledge. So to hear all of these parallels and unconscious reference points in the work is actually quite moving, because I write so quickly and put things out into the public domain, often without much thought. So I've never actually zoomed out and looked at my work and tried to connect those dots. So it's really nice to think about being in conversation with these traditional romantic poets, sort of honouring what they offered to the canon, but also offering this almost subversion, or this pushback to the one particular voice we're used to hearing when it comes to not just poetry, but how we talk about nature, our relationship to nature. I really love irreverence. I love cheekiness. I love play. I love subverting the idea that poetry must have this formality to it, as if we are addressing people from a podium or a lectern. And whenever I perform and I go into a space and there's a lectern, I always shudder, because I'm like, I'm not at school assembly, for fuck's sake. Like I want to talk to people as they are, like they would be at the pub or a cafe, or sat by the river.
It sounds so romantic. Their initial kind of premise was to speak in the voice of ordinary people.
Exactly, and that's what bards of yore did, right? They weren't even, I mean, yes, you might have had your court poets, right, who were serving a different purpose, but generally speaking, the bards were the people that delivered the news and the important stories to the people that weren't literate, right? They remembered these huge, long, epic narrative poems that were actually had served some tangible social purpose of knowledge spreading, or if I belong to any tradition, it's more that, in the griots of West Africa and, all that sort of stuff. And I think spoken word definitely sits alongside that tradition.
I first came across you when you wrote for us at Writer's Mosaic about the African-American writer James Baldwin. Are you making a one-to-one pairing with the Black British situation? Or are you simply saying, let me listen to these people of African origin and see how they're coping and what their coping strategies are?
Yeah, I've definitely been considering the outsize influence of African American artists on my work. And of course, there's just more of them. So there is that. I also feel quite sad, really, that I haven't been able to draw as much from a Black British tradition, which we do have. And actually, the more I seek it out, the more developed I realize it is. I guess it's just that in this country, and actually all over the world, we're so beholden to America. Even when we talk about Black History Month in this country, we then start talking about Martin Luther King and Angela Davis, etc., etc. And we're not talking about Olive Morris. We're not talking about all the amazing Black British figures that we have in our historical canon. I do think there is something particularly rich and dynamic, and can I say there's like a swagger to the way a lot of African Americans write that is not quite the same here. I think probably Black British writers are influenced by a wider restraint. I think it's a stylistic restraint that British writers have, which is it's a choice, right? I'm as much a fan of a cool, clean, what did James Baldwin say? A sentence should be as clean as a bone, something like that. So I'm a fan of that, but as a writer myself, I like maximalism. I like This is why Toni Morrison to me is such a gorgeous writer. I think her work is meticulously crafted. It's not afraid to spill outside of itself. She writes like jazz musicians. She talked about that a lot. And that inspires me.
Where is your podium now? Who are you talking to?
I've not been performing as much because I've been trying to work out how I can try and take some of that energy and how it's informed me as an artist and bring that into prose, bring that into long form essay writing. And I'll be honest with you, it's really hard. But I've got a lot of reference points, again, in America that have inspired me, like Hanif Abdurraqib, who also came from the spoken word poetry tradition. And you can feel it. You can feel James Baldwin and his preacher roots. You can feel that in Hanif's work, that he was once a poet who had to stand on a stage and take people with him to whatever place or space the poem occupied. I'm really interested in essays that are lyrical, essays that are conversational, essays that are not afraid of ellipsis and loose ends. And, I love Saadia Hartman for that as well, and how she uses archive in these really playful ways. And yeah, I feel like there is a lot to be shaken up in the essay form, so that it feels more like that dance between audience and preacher or speaker or performer. It's really hard because, again, it's all happening in the cinema of someone's skull when they're sat with your book. They can't feel your breath or your pause. They can't see the sweat on your forehead, all the things that contribute to what makes these things so alive. But that's the challenge. That's the aim.
In that early poem, which you now slightly disavow, Take Up Space, there is a wonderful line in it, but it's so simple. Give yourself the benefit of the doubt. Give yourself the opportunity to change.
Yes.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
I am inherently suspicious of anyone whose opinions, art, way of being is exactly, if I meet you 1 year and then 10 years later you're on exactly the same thing, you're saying the same things, talking to exactly the same people, making the exact same art you were a decade ago, I'm immediately suspicious. Because if you are in and of the world, it is impossible to not constantly be shifting and adjusting to all the new information you're hearing and the new experiences you're encountering that humble you. Because, we build a lot of our ideas and beliefs in hypothesis, right? And then we grow up, we learn, we experience, and we go, that isn't as simple as I thought, or that didn't feel the way I thought it would feel, and you naturally adjust. But then I would say that because I feel very comfortable in that. Well, I'm comfortable with the discomfort of change, but I think actually a lot of people organize their life such that they don't have to move with the new evidence in front of them or the new feelings inside them, because it is uncomfortable. But for me, I love the artists who, even if you don't necessarily vibe with the new things they're doing, and you think, oh, well, I like their old stuff, you can see that actually they have the integrity to move with where they are at that point in time. I was literally reading Hanif Abdurraqib on Andre 3000, and the fact that Andre 3000 said, you know what, I'm not really rapping right now, I'm playing the flute. And that most people don't want to hear Andre play the flute, but he has the integrity to be with what feels right to him, right? So yeah, I'm all about change. I'm very mercurial. It's because I'm a Gemini. Yeah, the best writers, I think, exist on the peripheries. They might marginally belong to lots of different places and spaces, but they're at their core someone who doesn't neatly fit into any one place. I don't think you can observe the world in any really sort of strong and sophisticated way if you're too immersed within your particular allegiances or place or space. People could disagree with me on that because people have written from, from a very embedded place of wherever they come from, for sure. But I don't know, I'm drawn to writers who, when you look into their biography, you're like, oh, they were a bit of a floater, They grew up here and then they went over there, or they may have been in one place their whole life, but they never quite felt like they fit in. And those people tend to have the most interesting observations. Yeah.
You've been writing a series of essays, which I understand have been focused on Michael.
On MJ,
Michael Jackson.
The ultimate shapeshifter.
Now, you fixed in prose on doing a series of essays focusing on a tarnished idol. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that is your chosen topic?
I was so in love with Michael Jackson for the entirety of my childhood. It's so hard to describe it in words. I guess it's like people trying to describe falling in love with another human being interpersonally. And people might mock the idea of being in love with a celebrity you've never met. But I would say that it's more ardent because you can project whatever you like onto them, right? They can't speak back to that love. So it can grow as large and as unruly as you like. So yeah, it was so total and it was so pure, that love, that obsession. I really wanted to unpack why I found it so difficult as an adult, with all of the morals I had and the critical thinking that I liked to believe I possessed, to accept that he might have done what he'd been accused of. My logical brain could see the evidence in front of me, understood that generally speaking, people don't lie about things of that nature, but my heart just could not bear the weight of it. And I'm really interested in that dissonance and how it speaks to our general inability to sit with how we can love a person and also see and hold account for their transgressions, I had to write it out. It's the classic thing, when you're a writer, this is how you deal with the big knots. You have to try and write them out somehow. You have to think your way into some sort of way forward. And I have to say, even as I'm nearing the end of the book process, I still don't know what the answer is. It's so incredibly difficult to hold two conflicting ideas in your head at once. They say that's the sign of intelligence. But it's deeply, deeply unsettling to not be able to conclude one thing or the other. So Michael Jackson is an allegory for so many things, the anxieties of race, of the body, of love, of the African-American popular culture tradition, of fame, of sex, of queerness, so many things. He's the gift that keeps on giving as a metaphor. I'll say that.
Take me something through the moment when you realised that this was an obsession, this was a love, this was something into which you had placed so much trust and belief and faith, and the moment of disappointment.
I wish I could say it was a moment. It was so latent and it took so long for the probable truth to really land for me, because when the second spate of allegations came out in something like 2005, was it? I just refused to believe it was true. I just refused to believe it. And so, several years went by, he died in 2009. And I think only a couple of years after that, as I was really developing in my feminist principles, my obvious support for survivors of sexual assault, and knowing how very difficult and isolating it is for people to come forward with such a thing, I had to really sit with my own hypocrisy and say, Vanessa, if it were anybody else, you wouldn't even question it. You would never be so resistant to what appears to be, by all accounts, the truth of the matter, right? And I had to sit with that and say, oh, okay, well, maybe this is what is happening everywhere all the time when these cases occur. People are wanting to protect fathers, bosses, brothers, lovers from the consequences of their actions, because we have complicated relationships with people that do awful things, They've transgressed terribly, but they also are our musical idols, or they're our lovers, or they're the people that pay our bills. And unfortunately, we often decide that, what these people give us matters more than what they've taken from another person. And I think we all need to sit with the reality of that and how we are all complicit in abuse because of that. I'm fascinated by making it a collective reckoning rather than putting just the abusers themselves in the spotlight.
Let me point out to people listening that you are an aficionado of, a practitioner of, a lover of ballroom. The ballroom that came out of the kind of queer scene in New York in the 60s and 70s.
You'll have to read the essay that I wrote to get my, really considered and well-honed thoughts on this. But what I will say is that queerness, for all of the difficulty of being queer in this world, they have all the answers, man. Not to say that it's a utopian community or state, but just the notion that the way you love has to be prescribed, the way you dress has to be prescribed, the relationship you have to your body, or these arbitrary markers of man, woman, person, whatever. The idea that all of that has to be handed to you from on high. You know, that just doesn't apply in that space, and it's beautiful. I'm not someone who has a particular issue with being called a woman. I guess I identify with it for lack of anything more interesting, but it's just amazing to be in a space where actually, if I felt like walking in here and really embodying my masculine energy, I wouldn't be made to feel aberrant for that. And I love that I can play and I can be cheeky, insouciant, playful in that place. So yeah, there's so much I could say, but I'll leave it there.
Vanessa Kisuule was in conversation with Gabriel Gbadamosi. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.